Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm drawing a landscape in colored pencil. I'm going to draw this coastal scene and I'm going to use toned paper, but it's not just going to be regular paper. I primed it with some clear gesso. So let's see how it was done. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sketch out the shape of that rocky shore because I want to be able to work around it with some brighter colors. And let me say a few more words about the materials, because I already mentioned that the paper is primed with clear gesso. So this is a Fabriano toned paper called Sand. And the pencils are Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils. But in order for the pencils to work better on this surface, I prime it with some clear gesso. Clear gesso creates a textured, rough surface that allows me to blend more easily, to create brighter colors, to layer more easily, and to put lighter details on top of the darker layers more easily. So basically it allows me to do things with colored pencils that I can't do on regular paper. So let me get back to narrating the drawing process. I started with the sky here, and I'm going to try to do something a little bit different, because I'm going to start with some cooler colors at the top, almost grayish. I started with a sky blue and then added, or actually it was a light ultramarine, and then I added a little bit of light gray to it. And here I will have kind of a blurry, less defined line on the horizon between the ocean and the sky. So I want that line of the horizon to kind of fade and almost merge into the sky. So after I laid down those two colors, I did some blending with my finger. And on this surface it's easier to blend with your finger as well as other blending tools, because the rough surface creates a bit of residue that you can move around, and when you use your finger you can push it in and you can actually blend pretty nicely. I also added a touch of light phthalo blue, because I felt that maybe the color should be a little bit warmer, because the color of the ocean is definitely going to be warmer. We're going to have some greenish elements in it. So for the water I started with a slightly darker color. I used some Prussian blue, but here I will not insist on a clean edge, as I've already mentioned. I will create a blurry, less defined edge. And I started by laying down a little bit of that darker color, but I will not keep it like that. I decided to add some lighter and more greenish elements to it. So I used this light turquoise color on top of that, and I also added a touch of that light ultramarine that I used for the sky, because I want to have a bit of a transition, almost like a gradient. And now you can see as I'm blending, I'm not even trying to keep that clean edge. I deliberately want to create a slightly blurry edge in the distance. And I'm also making sure that I don't have too much of a contrast in terms of colors. But as I go down closer to the foreground, closer to our viewpoint, there will be more greenish and turquoise elements, or turquoise colors. Here I started working on these rocks here, and we have a rocky shore, and I could just work on top of this sand color, the background color of my paper, with some darker colors like dark sepia or even a black colored pencil, and I could get some nice looking rocks rather. But I wanted to put in some slightly warmer colors first, because I intend to shade this in such a manner so that I create some texture, and so that some of that background color of the paper is still coming through, so that it can still be seen through those darker colors that I plan to lay down. Because I plan to lay them down in such a way as to create texture. I don't want to cover all of it because I'm drawing a rough surface and I want to give the viewer that impression that they're looking at a rough surface, and to achieve that I want to keep that texture. So I started by laying down some of the darker brownish and black tones for the shadow areas, and now I'm just going to draw a bunch of these rocks here. And like I said, I'm mostly going to use a combination of dark sepia and a bit of black colored pencil for some of those darker areas. Now, this part of those rocks to the left is going to be a little bit darker because it's largely in the shadow, and that portion of that land or that shore which is sticking out in the middle is going to be a little bit lighter because it's exposed to the light source, and we're also going to have some slightly warmer colors there. But right now I'm using a black colored pencil to define some of the darkest shadow areas. So first I want to define the overall shape of that part of the land here. And this is a pretty easy process, I think, if you understand the basics. It looks pretty realistic and it can look a little bit confusing to beginners, but the trick is to remember where the light source is and to stay consistent with that, because in our case the light source is coming from above, as is usually the case with most landscapes, because it's coming from the sun, from the light source. And in this case it's also coming more from the left, so all of these shapes will be casting a little bit of shadow to the right, and all of the right sides of these smaller shapes within this larger shape will have to be darker. So as long as you stay consistent with that, you should be fine. Now it looks like I'm ruining it right now because I covered everything with a little bit of darker color and I lost a lot of that contrast, but that's okay because I want this part of those rocks to be largely in the shadow. I still do have some range of value because, as you can see, some of those darkest areas still stand out, and more importantly I still have a lot of texture to imitate the rough surface of those rocks. But I think the relationship between the darker and lighter areas is even more important than texture, naturally, because it is that contrast in value that helps you explain the shapes to the viewer. The texture is more like a cherry on top because it gives the viewer an illusion like they're looking at something really complex that has a lot of details, like they're looking at a specific kind of a surface, in this case a rocky, rough surface. So this part of those rocks here in the middle are more exposed to the sunlight, and I'm going to make these considerably lighter overall, but there are lots of smaller shapes here, so I need to indicate that there are a lot of these smaller shadow areas there. But I also introduced some not just lighter but warmer colors here, and I added even some ochre and some reddish tones. Now I ran into a bit of a problem here because my sketch wasn't really definite enough or precise enough, so I didn't draw all the way to the edge of my sketch with those bluish and greenish colors or turquoise colors. So now I had to work around those darker shapes, which can cause a bit of muddying, but it wasn't too much of a problem because this rough surface really allows you to layer lighter colors on top of the darker ones very easily, so I was able to fix it and to work around those darker edges. It's just that the blending is a little bit more tricky and you need to be a bit more careful. So as you can see here in this middle portion of the water of the ocean, I am starting to make a transition towards some slightly warmer and more greenish colors. But before I did that, I picked up a white colored pencil and decided to put in some suggestions of splashing waves and foamy waves around the rocks, as well as somewhere in the distance here and there, just to indicate the movement of the water, to create that suggestion of the waves and the movement of the water. You can see that I'm getting very nice, very clean white marks, and I'm pretty much able to do whatever I like. And the reason why I'm able to do that is because I'm working on paper primed with clear gesso. You would achieve a similar effect if you worked on sandpaper or a sanded paper of artist quality of any kind, like UArt or something like that. The reason why you're able to do that is because this textured surface allows you to add layer upon layer, including adding lighter marks on top of the layers of darker value, which is very important because when you're working in colored pencil, sometimes it just feels more natural to draw the shadow areas or the darker areas first and then put some lighter areas or lighter shapes on top of that. And on regular paper you can't really do that. You're mostly restricted to working from light to dark, and if you want some really bright colors, really bright highlights or details, you either have to try to reserve the white space in those areas, or you have to work around those portions of lighter color, or you have to try to erase a little bit, which can't always be that easy, and you can't always achieve clean marks that way. So I went over the sketch of those rocks in the foreground at the bottom, just to make them a little bit more defined, and now I'm back to using a white colored pencil to draw the line of those waves, to draw the line of the water on the beach, because that edge of the water where the waves are washing out on that sandy beach is going to be a little bit foamy, and it's going to be a bit lighter or white. And now as for the color of the beach, of this sandy area in the middle, I could just leave this background color, but I want to make it a little bit more interesting. I'm going to add a touch of ochre to it, and also some brownish colors as well. The reason why I want to do that is because I want to make the color of the sand a bit more interesting. I want to add a bit more texture, and also I want to add some details, like maybe suggestions of some irregularities in that sandy terrain. I also added some pinkish elements to it, and after that I did a bit of blending with my middle finger. I try to use different fingers for different colors, so that I can reduce the amount of muddying of colors. Now here, remember I told you that the light source is coming from above and from the left, which means that the shadows will be cast to the right. So these large rocks on the left edge of the scene are going to be casting a bit of shadow to the right, and right now I'm drawing that shadow. For the shadow, I'm just going to use a bit of this dark sepia to make the sand below those rocks a bit darker, and then I'm going to have to do some blending, because I don't want the shadow area to be as textured or as detailed as the rocks themselves. The shadow is simply a darker part of that sand, so I can't have a texture that looks like that rocky surface above them. Here next to that line of the waves on the beach, I'm gonna have a slightly bluish and grayish area where there is a strip of wet sand, because the waves are kind of receding here, and we can imagine that this part of the beach was covered with water a few minutes ago, or maybe a few hours ago, and that's why the sand is so wet, and maybe it's reflecting a little bit of that grayish and bluish color, those bluish tones from the sky. And now I want to add some more foamy and splashy details to those waves. Now for this middle part here of the water, I'm going to start introducing more and more of those turquoise and greenish elements. I believe this is a cobalt blue. I'm not really sure which one it was that I used, but it's, let's say, it's kind of like a middle greenish blue. It's a little bit darker than some of the other colors that I used so far, and I want this part of the water to be a little bit darker and a little bit more greenish. I also added a bit of the other colors that I used into the mix, some of the other bluish tones that I used for the rest of the water and the sky, because I want to stay consistent with the overall lighting, and like I said, I want to have a bit of a transition between the more greenish and warmer tones here closer to the foreground, and I want to make those colors a little bit cooler and more bluish and grayish back there in the background. And of course I have to do a lot of blending with my finger because I've mostly blended with my fingers in this scene, and the reason why I was able to do that was because I don't really need much precision for these larger areas. I only have to be careful when I have to work around the edges of those rocks, but for this sandy beach area I don't really have to worry too much about edges or anything like that. After that I added some lighter details, like some suggestions of waves and ripples in the water using the lighter turquoise color. And that'll make those waves appear a little bit more, or rather that surface of the water appear a little bit more complex and a bit more interesting. So I kept adding some of those, a combination of lighter and darker colors in the water, just to make the surface of the water more interesting and to create some suggestions of the movement of the water. And then I added some darker areas here and there in this foreground area or midground area, whatever it is, because I want to create some suggestions of maybe some rocks which can be seen through the water. Like you can barely see the shapes of those rocks through the water because the water is largely clear and transparent. And then I'm just going to keep working on the waves. I'm going to add a few more larger waves here in the distance, like some of those. I'm going to stack them like this, one behind the other, like they're kind of coming up on the shore. And I'm going to make some of them a bit whiter and more splashy. And I'm going to work my way to the foreground area here. I'm going to add a little bit more foam on these waves on the beach to make those more detailed. I'm just adding some random white marks to try to imitate the appearance of splashing waves washing out on the shore, and adding a few touches of that lighter value behind them as well, to create suggestions of the movement of the water. I did a bit of blending on this shadow area here because I needed to make it a bit smoother. And I also cleaned up the edges of that shadow because I felt that the shadow itself needed to be a bit better defined. Finally, I'm going to move on to this foreground area. And I have a bunch of rocks here as well. And for these, I'm just going to use the same approach that I did with the rocks over there in the distance. I'm going to define some of the dark shadow areas first, And once that contrast is established, I'm going to try to create some texture and to add some interesting tones and colors to the rest of the surface of those rocks. I'm also going to want to make sure that those rocks stand out nicely against both that shadow area as well as the sandy beach area below them. So contrast is always important, but right now I'm focusing on the colors and the texture on these portions, these lighter portions of those rocks. And in addition to the brownish colors, I'm going to add some grayish and even some reddish and ochre tones to them here and there, just to have a little bit more variation of colors in those rocks. So I'm just dragging my pencil and allowing it to create some random shapes, random marks and random textures. This is where this rough textured surface really works for you, because clear gesso isn't that useful for drawing or covering those larger areas like the sky and some of the ocean, which need to be mostly smooth and kind of monotonous in terms of the amount of detail and texture. But when it comes to these detailed or more detailed parts of the scene, especially the ones in the foreground, this textured surface primed with clear gesso really helps you create that illusion of detail, because as you simply drag your pencil, it creates a ton of texture, and you can basically use that texture to create suggestions of shapes or suggestions of a rough looking surface without much effort. And the good thing about clear gesso is that the pencil will create that rough texture, but if you don't want it, if you don't need it, you can always use your blending tools or your fingers to smooth it out. So you can really control the amount of texture and the amount of that illusion of detail that you want to create in different parts of the scene. I talked about these things a lot in my series on drawing landscape in colored pencil, as well as on my videos on Patreon. So if you want to learn more about that, you should either browse through my videos here on YouTube, or you should check out my Patreon, because I talk about these things in more detail over there. So these rocks in the foreground are almost done, and now I want to add some more details to this sandy area here in the middle. I'm going to add some slightly darker brownish details or brownish shapes to that sandy area, just to create a suggestion like there are some variation in the terrain. I also want to add a little bit more variation in terms of color, and I want to make some suggestions like because of the tide, the water was already there on some parts of that beach, so maybe there are some traces of that movement of the water, where the sand was kind of moved by those waves, or stacked or piled up by those waves. But the drawing is almost done. I'm just going to add a few more of these slightly smaller, darker rocks here, and the drawing is now finished. I'm going to put my signature in the lower right corner here, and the scene is complete. If you want to see longer videos, if you want to see more content, you should check out my Patreon. And also don't forget to subscribe here, don't forget to give me a like and comment, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. I'm going to see you in the next one, and bye for now.